really, I ask you to do so because I like Hungary. I like certainly the Hungarian literature and culture. That is in any way to stop to say here, oh, that's an action against Hungary, an action against the Hungarian people. You are not Hungary. You are the government of Hungary and the leader of a political party. And Hungary is far more and far more eternal than you are. But my intervention is not to you. My intervention is not to you. It is especially to colleagues of us, to the colleagues of the EPP. And I have one plea, that is that hopefully this evening they follow their conscience when they decide on this. And I know that's not always easy to do so, because we are talking about somebody of the family, and I can tell you I have got the same problem at a certain moment. That was the moment where we had a dilemma to push out of our family Jörg Haider of the FPÖ, and we did it at the end, also based on conscience, because we thought that more important than size and power is in fact principles and values. And the second reason is for European reasons, Manfred. What we are living today is the survival and existential battle on the survival of the European project. And Mr. Orban is publicly siding with Salvini, openly discussing the disruption of this European project. Well, we need that it not happens in the coming years. And my last argument and reason is mainly because, and I will recognise it, that doesn't happen often, that the European Union is based on Christian democratic principles, beliefs and energy for decades. And we all know them: Adenauer, Schuman, Monnet, De Gasperi. And I want to use the words of one of these giants, of Robert Schuman, and I will quote him. Christianity teaches us equality of all men, without distinction between race, colour, class or profession. The dignity of each human person in protection of his individual liberty and with respect of his individual rights by practicing brotherly love to all. So I want to plead to you, my Christian democratic colleagues, to recognise that the way Schuman looked to Christianity is in many ways exactly the opposite, as a divisive, narrow and destruction action and opinions of Mr. Orban. So, dear colleagues, please for once see that he is the seed of discord that will ultimately destroy our beautiful European project. And please, together with us, stop this nightmare this evening in your group. Thank you.
For the group of the Greens, Mr. Philippe Lambert. Colleagues, Prime Minister, the European Union is founded on values of respect for human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, the rule of law, and the respect for human rights, including the rights of people who belong to minorities. These values are common to the Member States in a society in which pluralism, non-discrimination, tolerance, justice, solidarity and equality between women and men prevail. That is what is stated, colleagues, in Article 2 of the Treaty on European Union. The European Union, more than a market, is a union of values, values which on the basis of our factual report from the Parliament have been called into question by the actions of the Hungarian government. Prime Minister, it isn't about Hungary or the Hungarian people, it is the actions taken by the government of Hungary, and I know an awful lot of Hungarians who do not recognise themselves in that. And under democracy, just because you have that, it doesn't mean any old action is legitimate. So neither nepotism or the abuse of European funds, or the violations of academic values, nor the stifling of independent media and NGOs, nor the attacks against the judiciary are compatible with European values. And addressing myself to the defenders of the Christian values, which you say you are, that saying that you will not feed asylum seekers, I think is totally contradictory to the message of the gospel. And you cannot simply state that the Sargentini report is a web of lies. That won't get rid of the reality, which is that were your country to be applying to the EU, as Guy Verhofstadt has just said, these days it would not be admitted without some fundamental changes to its structures and to its legislation. Now, as others before you, Prime Minister, you have very often said that the European Union is just like the defunct Soviet Union. That is outrageous. Hungary freely, I repeat, freely decided to join the EU, and as far as I know, the tanks of the European Union were never found on the streets of the capital of a country by force and stayed there by force. But do not get this wrong. We believe that the place of Hungary is within the very heart of the European Union, and there are no second-tier members in the European Union. But if belonging to the Union means that there are rights and advantages, there are also responsibilities and obligations. And launching these Article 7 procedures says one thing, so that is that we are going to be making sure that those obligations are respected. And to my colleagues in the EPP, I would say that Fidesz, Mr. Orban's party, is in your ranks. They were often seen as the black sheep of your family. These days, they seem to be determined to setting the direction of your party, adopting language and a posture and policies which are copying the extreme right in Europe and even in the United States. How can you still say that no red lines are being crossed? Where are your limits? Are you going to be abandoning your humanist values to campaign on the extreme right lines? Are you going to have a common list with them? Are you going to govern with them? Are you going to simply copy their programme? There was a 215 document from the EPP, a resolution on protecting the Union and promoting our values. That was the title. And in that you said, and I quote, liberal democracy based on the primacy of law and a multi-party system, a strong civil society, the freedom of expression, the freedom of association. And let me conclude by saying that the report on the Sargentini report will give you a unique opportunity, colleagues in the EPP, to walk the walk as well as talking the talk and make a strong gesture. I do hope that there will be a number of you who do make that strong gesture. Thank you very much indeed. For the Greens in jail, Ms. Bergier.
Thank you very much, President. If I believe the Hungarian press, the Sargentini report was sold to Mr. Soros. The billionaire, Mr. Soros, is not really our cup of tea, believe us. Let's avoid characterizations. We still believe in democracy. And if you read the Sargentini report, you will see that it's based on the Council of Europe, the Venice Commission, and the EU. This is not a condemnation of the Hungarian people or the country, but it is a question of respecting European Union rules. So this is something that was accepted by the government of Hungary and your government, Mr. Orban, when you were Prime Minister until 2002. At the time, you were liberal. But freedom is no longer a central issue in your government. Democracy is boiled down to a political majority which rules at whim. And so in Hungary, yes, there is a regression in rights for the education, the press, for cities, for NGOs, and it's unbridled liberalism for the economy. And there are many funds that have been misappropriated in your favor. And it is not surprising that you are aligning yourself with Mr. Salvini. Your liberalism is the worst kind of nationalism, xenophobia, etc. And so we have to see who's applauding you. Yes, go ahead and heckle. I'm fine. Take your responsibility, and we will be responsible tomorrow, and we will call a spade a spade.
Per il gruppo Europa della Libertà e della Democrazia Diretta.
For the EDFF, Mr. Farage.
Well, Mr. Orban, thank God there's at least one European leader prepared to stand up for his principles, his nation, his culture and his people in the face of such extreme bullying. Thank God you're there, is all I can say. And I'm sure for Hungarians of a certain age, today will have brought back many dark memories. You're here at a show trial where a bunch of political nonentities get up and point the finger and scream, enjoying themselves with their afternoon hate. And the chief prosecutor, the commissar that comes from the unelected government, he has the audacity to lecture you on democracy. You don't know what you're talking about. The fact that you've got 50% of the vote in your country and that no one has ever voted for Timmermans or can't remove him seems to have passed him by.
How many times have you
he's also telling you you're not getting your judicial appointments right, you've got to change things. This is the man who's one of the bosses of a European Commission that appoints Martin Selmayr driving a coach and horses through all the rules that exist here. You're being told what is really happening here, Mr. Orban, is they're just updating the Brezhnev doctrine of limited sovereignty. There's no point pretending in this union you're independent. There's no point pretending you run your own country. And Article 7 is the new method of adopting that. They want to strip you of your voting rights. They want to stop giving you European funding. And all of it because you have the audacity to stand up to George Soros, the man who has poured $15 billion all over the world in trying to break down the nation states, to get rid of our traditional forms of democracy. And in Hungary, of course, he spent money to promote illegal immigration into your country, and you, quite rightly, have stood up to him and closed him down. I wish we all did the same. Mr. Orban, you keep saying you want to stay a member of this European Union, but it's not just your country that's been insulted today. You've been insulted today. Time to be more logical. Come and join the Brexit club. You'll love it.
For the Europe of Nations and Freedom, Mr. Bay. Prime Minister, Madam Sargini claims that your government refuses to enter into dialogue. However, over and above your permanent representation, you have twice sent your Minister for Foreign Affairs to public hearings in the Libe Committee. Madam Sargentini claims that you hold this Parliament in disdain, but this is already the third time that you have been here to respond to the constant attacks on your government. In actual fact, this is not a report, it's an indictment. It is a witch hunt, no more, no less. It accuses you in particular of not respecting the independence of the judiciary, while at the same time allowing itself to criticise the decisions taken by Hungarian judges and giving its views on cases still underway. This Sargentini report also criticises your electoral system, although it allows all opinions to be represented proportionally, whereas in France, for example, a party which has 15 to 25% of the votes and has done for 20 years manages to get 7 deputies out of a total of 577. Non-elected bureaucrats, Mr. Timmermans, confiscate democracy and impose on people this migratory wave, but your government is the only to have consulted its citizens on exactly how to resolve this existential crisis, such as we have never seen before. We are bombarded with these supposed values of the European Union, or it's supposedly an open society where we have multiculturalism, but that is against our traditions, against our identities, against the Christian roots of our civilization. And faced with these deadly ideologies, it is you, Prime Minister, who is the real defender of the values of our civilization. Against communism today and against yesterday against globalization today, and perhaps your worst adversary is Prime Minister within the EPP, because in the Le Monde newspaper, Mr. Weber supported Mr. Timmermans against you, and he said that he was very close to his social democratic friends. Prime Minister, facing these European elections, facing Merkel and Macron, who want more immigration and more federalism, you, together with Matteo Salvini, are spearheading another Europe, the Europe that we love, the Europe that we want, that of nations, that of cooperation, that of protection, and that, of course, of freedoms. Thank you.
Onorevole Morvai.
Morvai, non-attached.
Köszönöm szépen.
Thank you. This is a very special day today because there are two prime ministers here today. We listened to two prime ministers, and there are two different voices, two different opinions, and this is where we'll have to take our decision in May 2019. Well, earlier, Mr. Tsipras has seen better days. Well, he was here today, and for the joy of those present, he said everything that we wanted to hear. We actually hosted migrants and allowed same-sex marriages, he said, and then he also talked about the privatization of national treasures in order to make foreign banks richer. We sent the IMF home, we Hungarians. We said no to mass migration, and we defended our own borders. We defended the borders of Europe. We protect and defend our Christian roots, Christian values. So I state once again, in May 2019, there will be a huge opportunity for us to choose between the two sets of values. Thank you.
Thank you very much, President, Prime Minister. Dear Mrs. Vergia, you were talking about who is applauding whom. You are a communist. Your comrades destroyed my country. And you dare criticizing us, lecturing us on democracy and on the rule of law. According to this report, Hungary is a risk to rule of law. This is a lie. This is true of those who are criticizing Hungary, Judith Sargentini, the left, Libe. What is rule of law, my friends? Rule of law means that it is not particular groups who have power, but law. First of all, the treaty calls upon the parliament to act according to union law. In point C, there is a statement that there is no specific fact in which Hungary is not in compliance with union law. So the report actually lists a number of issues which are in exclusive national competence. This is against the rule of law. Since Roman law, accused persons are to be given a fair chance to defend themselves. In this debate, the representative of Hungary received 5 minutes to talk. This is a slap in the face of the rule of law. This is a disgrace. Are you afraid of words? In a rule of law, it wouldn't be possible to play around with the rules of the procedure. That is, abstention is not going to be counted in total votes. Those are giving a lecture to Hungary who don't want to adhere to their own rules. They do this to take revenge on Hungary, on the Hungarian people who are against mass migration and against Viktor Orban. There is a Hungarian saying which says literally that the owl is accusing the sparrow of being beat-headed. That is a person accusing an innocent person of something in which they themselves are guilty.
l'importanza e la delicatezza del dibattito, dato l'altissimo numero di partecipanti.
Given that it's a very delicate discussion and a very high number of speakers, I'm not going to have any blue cards. The floor now goes to Ms. Weidenholzer.
Thank you, Mr. Tajani. Well, President, colleagues, I think today's debate is going to enter into the history books. It's the first time that we are discussing the beginning of Article 7 proceedings in a country. That is no laughing matter, because that's discussing a breach of the fundamental values of the Union set down in Article 2 of the TEU. Now, if the fundamentals are being attacked, then we need to act. We cannot grant someone a pass. We're not acting against member state. We are acting in favour of our own common interest. It's also inappropriate to assert here that this resolution is punishing a country, as Hungary's foreign minister keeps saying again and again. No, this report is not a collection of lies as it is accused of being. That is not how a diplomat speaks, let alone anyone who's interested in a constructive, factual debate. So I would like to ask Mr. Orban to make that clear to his foreign minister. So these accusations are unjustified. On the contrary, we have tried to work on the basis of provable facts, and the rapporteur has been very conscientious in her work and her preliminary studies. The report's conclusions are clear, and the large majority of the Libe Committee voted to recommend voting in favour of the report. It is now for plenary to decide, and we need a clear vote. It makes no sense to kick this into the long grass any longer. These are not problems that will solve themselves. And certainly, they're not things you can sit on. So, to make things quite clear, ladies and gentlemen, there is no such thing as an illiberal democracy. Eastern Europe has experienced that at bitter first hand in the past, and it was called euphemistically popular democracy. Respect for political minorities, freedom of opinion, separation of powers, judicial independence, and a lively civil society. Without all those things, democracy cannot function. As I said, it is up to us now to send a historic signal. Thank you.
Onorevole Jurek.
Oh, Prime Minister, Mr. Tajani, ladies and gentlemen, the writer of this report started this debate by asking a question. She asked, what state is the Union in? Let me answer that. The Union is decaying. It is in crisis because of attempts like today's to exclude Hungary from co-decision in European affairs. But just look at, say, 2 or 3 days ago. Look at the edition of Le Monde. There was 2 Europes there, Mr. Macron's Europe and Mr. Orban's Europe. That is the face of today's Europe, which is divided rather than united. You are trying to stop the course of history. History is on the march. It is not just on the march through the steppes of Hungary, but it's on the march from Sweden all the way down to Italy. And maybe Stalin was able to turn back rivers, but the march of progress of history cannot be stopped. History goes on, and either we accept changes and we will negotiate with countries who want to adapt to their own needs, or we will truly fall apart, which will result in the destruction of the European Union. In Article 2 of the Treaty of the European Union, we have set down those values which unite us. You want to turn those values into an instrument of thought policing. No, that system doesn't exist yet. Europe is a union of countries and not of ideology. Thank you.
Onorevole Intveld.
Ms. Intveld.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I'm delighted to hear the ardent plea of Mr. Jurek for upholding Article 2 of the treaties, because the funny thing here is, Mr. Orban, you claim that the European Union wants to impose things on your country, but your country was the first country to ratify the Lisbon Treaty, and I'm sure that you've read Article 2 before you put your signature to it. So all we are doing is keeping you to your word. And you know what? The Hungarian people want you to keep your word because they want to remain at the heart of the European Union. But then you have to play by the rules and respect the rules. Now, debates like today are about a very difficult situation, and some people are getting a little bit desperate about how to get out of this. But I think this is just a very difficult phase in a bigger process of the European Union coming of age as a community of values and a community of law. And we will get out of this situation. But we should do that by de-dramatising and depoliticising. You put a lot of drama in your speeches, but I actually prefer the approach of Mrs. Sargentini, which is very factual, fact-based and accurate. And the report of Mrs. Sargentini is a very accurate picture of the state of play of democracy and the rule of law in your country, and it's not a pretty sight. Now, you talk about the Hungarian people, but you know what, Mr. Orban? We all have voters here, and my voters ask me, you know, why do we have to respect the rules and the Hungarian government doesn't have to? Why are we giving Mr. Orban 87 million euros a week in order to destroy the European Union? Why do they get away with it? Well, I have difficulty answering to my voters. It's not just your voters we're talking about, it's about all the European citizens. So we have a duty to hold you to the same rules and standards as everybody else. And then finally, the real message of today's debate is not about pointing the finger at Hungary or criticising Hungary. This is a strong message of the European Parliament. We are not willing to let Hungary go. We didn't walk the road until here, and bringing Hungary on board, being a member of this family in order to let go. Hungary is a member of this family, and we will fight to get Hungary back on track and give the Hungarian citizens the European values that they are entitled to like anybody else. And that is what we'll be voting tomorrow.
Onorevole Franz.
Herr Orban.
Mr. Orban, the way you treat minorities is how you can tell the stamp of a government, its attitude to democracy, the rule of law, and to human rights. These three pillars are essential for freedom and peace in Europe. Real peace only arises when you accept differences. It is not for no reason that the EU's motto is unity in diversity. But it is the Roma in particular, who are EU citizens, Hungarian citizens, who are the victim of institutional anti-Gypsyism and discrimination from both governmental and non-governmental bodies. Mr. Orban, take up your historic responsibility towards your national minorities. Accept that responsibility once and for all so that Hungary can become an example of the rule of law, democracy and for the respect of the value of all people. Now, you, citizens of Hungary, you are strong. So stand up against right-wing extremism. Help shape a Europe of just values where racism has no place.
Onorevole Björk. Onorevole Björk.
Björk.
It's a little bit difficult if it's okay.
Onorevole, non siamo. Sono io che presiedo, lei aspetta.
I am the one chairing this. Please wait, I will listen to you in a minute. Ms. Björk first, please. Thank you.
Democracy is not something that's just written on paper. This is not just something that you can talk about. It's something fundamental, and it allows us to live together. We heard about what Mr. Orban has done, and we have to vote on this tomorrow. But what I find disturbing is these ideas of nations and the extreme right in the European Parliament. It's an authoritarian state, hostile to democracy, a racist state that's dangerous to women and others who are men or women, brothers and sisters. This is something that is dangerous to democracy because you're destroying it. We do not want racism. We don't want oppression. And we must fight against this. And the European Parliament must diligently work against this on the basis of the report. I will be voting in favor of the report because anything else would be shameful. We must do our work. These are the fundamental rights of the European Union that must be upheld. Thank you.
Yes, please.
Thank you, Mr. President, for hearing my point of order. I rise as one of the 4 members of the European Parliament who are from the Roma minority. And could I honourably remind members that Livia Jurovska, one of the Fidesz MEPs, is one of the other 4 Roma MEPs. She sits on the right of politics, and all Roma are not necessarily on the left of politics, just like all people within society. And this talk of anti-Roma, Mr. Orban has a Roma MEP who sits as a Vice President of the European Parliament.
Bene, grazie.
Thank you, Mr. Carver. I can confirm that there is a Vice President of the European Parliament that is a parliamentarian that comes from the EPP and is from Fidesz as well, who is Roma. That is quite true indeed, Vice President of the European Parliament. That is something known throughout the European Parliament, that he has fought strongly for the defence of the Roma. So what Mr. Carver has just said is quite right, and I'm only giving that by way of information. The floor now goes to Mr. Moten.
Herr Präsident.
Mr. Tajani, now today's discussion is incredible. The idea to take voting rights away from Hungary. Ladies and gentlemen, I think today's discussion will go down in the history books, because we have seen the decline of social democracy all across Europe. That's what happens if you have a bureaucratic elite which acts against the interests of its voters. And today I think will also mark the beginning of the end of Christian democracy in Europe. Now, dear EPP colleagues, the way that you've dealt with Mr. Orban, the principle of subsidiarity and sovereignty, that all shows how deeply socialist thinking has got within your ranks. But please, just please continue on your current path, which will only be to the benefit of Europe's citizens, because it means that Christian democracy will follow social democracy to the grave, and from 2019 that will be reflected in the composition of this House. Mr. Orban, please be reassured that there are millions of people in my own country of Germany who are fully behind you and your policy of defending conservative and liberal democratic European values. Please don't be put off by the pseudo-moralist heckling of this House, whatever happens tomorrow. Thank you.
Onorevole Zylstra.
Thank you very much, President. This resolution is an attack on Hungary as a sovereign country, and it's fundamentally anti-democratic. The aim is to undermine a country where the government has been democratically elected and where there is freedom. And this Parliament wants to determine whether or not the laws of the country are in line with the EU laws. Viktor Orban has respected Schengen and fought against illegal migration. He's done it better than the European Commission themselves. And so I support the sovereignty of Hungary. And as Gerrit Wilders said, Orban has more character and spine than all of the other liberal leaders of the EU.
President, thank you very much. In 2015 already, the European Parliament levelled accusations at Hungary concerning the border fence to stop illegal migration. We should have actually received praise for that. Instead, we were accused of all sorts of things. And now you're expecting us to accept migrants according to a quota, but that is a decision that has failed, and you're expecting us to implement it. The report before the House talks about racism and violence and even anti-Semitism. I would like to really speak out against this accusation, which is slanderous. The report also talks about an increase in corruption, limitations on the rule of law, and it also talks about excessive government influence over the media. Now, if these accusations are based on facts, then I think we need to ask ourselves a question. To what extent is Hungary a free country in this day and age? For this report to pass, you need a 2/3 majority in favour. I personally will abstain in the vote. That means that I do not support this report, which is pro-migration, nor do I accept the triggering of the procedure according to Article 7, because incidentally, the ultimate outcome of that procedure will not be a government, but an entire country.
Onorevole Metsola.
Thank you. We are here today to show that politics must be about principle, about values, and that means taking tough but necessary decisions. Now, of course, we can choose to close our eyes, but too much of Europe's history is marked by terrible decisions taken in the name of expediency. We know that appeasement never works. We know that our values are worth more than just the paper they are written on, and we know that from some things we cannot look away. Europe is a hope, it is a promise, it is an ideal, and I see Europe as the pillar of light sandwiched between Trumpian clouds and Putinesque shadows. Our European way of freedom, of compassion, of fierce personal liberty, of passionate equality, rule of law, of free thought, of free movement and a free press, and of protection of minorities is a global symbol of enduring courage, and we should be proud of that. And the litmus test of a European nation is how well these values are nurtured and protected. And if, despite everything, despite all the calls to change direction, despite all the extended hands of friendship, our values remain under serious threat, as they are in Hungary, then we must act. We must choose the politics of hope over the politics of fear and cheap populism. We must protect the European way, always. And so, in the name of all those who sat in this chamber before us, in the name of all those who believed and who believe still, tomorrow I shall stand up for Europe.
Thank you very much. Dear Mr. Orban, this debate is not against Hungary. Slovenia loves Hungary. This debate deals with your politics of intolerance, lies and fear-mongering, which is dangerously spreading across the borders. Even into my country, your sister party has openly used your ways of fear-mongering in the recent campaign. This is just an example. Please take a look. The question is, where are Europeans safer? In Paris, with masked men, or in Budapest, where there's sun and tourists? You say that the report is dismissive to Hungarians. Well, a campaign like this is dismissive to all Europeans. That's why we have to act. And I'm sorry that today in the European Parliament we have to talk about the rule of law and democracy in one of our member states. We should fight against this We should support tolerance, dialogue, democratic values, dignity, and human values. Hungarians do not deserve to have anybody undermine their democracy. That's why I will support Madam Sargentini tomorrow and vote in favor. Thank you.
Onorevole Skripek.
Colleagues, this debate here is about much more than the fate of one nation. We are shaping the future of the European Union here, and there are complaints about the Hungarian institutions, Hungarian rule of law and so on. So yes, let us settle those questions then. But some would like to see Hungary and other Central European countries under control, obediently following the wrong directives of Brussels, given from above, according to the explanation of the common rules, but with different biases. It was mentioned here that we are united in diversity. So how does it come we want to kick out someone for being so different? We have some different opinions, yes. After 40 years of communist oppression, we are entitled to shape the EU project as well. We experienced totality already. We experienced dictate of the opinions. And here are so many wrong things with Europe today. Unrealistic federalisation, disrespect of the natural family of one man and one woman and of human dignity, more opposition of the freedom of speech. There are examples in European member states. Prime Minister Orban is no threat in comparison to the deformed version of democracy that the left-wing liberals are preaching to the EU states. It's a false gospel, and I ask you, let's deal with this one, please. Thank you.
Honorable Hirsch.
Sehr geehrte Kolleginnen und Kollegen, der Bericht zeigt...
Colleagues, the report quite clearly shows what the developments in Hungary are there. Democracy, values, freedom of expression are being swept away towards an illiberal democracy. Your words, Mr. Orban. And of course, this divides the country. The state doesn't trust its own citizens, certainly minorities, and subsequently everybody will be under suspicion. Mr. Orban, you personally are responsible for this drift towards an autocracy, a totalitarian democracy, and as a Democrat, it is my obligation to raise my voice against this, and it's no less my obligation to speak against those who cease to brush this aside, such as CSU, Mr. Söder, Mr. Seehofer in Bavaria. I don't want a government that likes the cut of the gibber and liberal democracy. EPP members, CSU, CDU members, please show us a clear signal in favour of European values. Please speak out against an illiberal democracy.
Honorable Joly.
Ms. Joly.
Monsieur le Premier Ministre.
Prime Minister, 1 minute will not suffice for me to list all the attacks you've perpetrated against the rule of law and democracy, against freedom of expression, against human dignity. Invoking Article 7 is an absolute necessity because you simply scorn European values on a daily basis, values which seek precisely to protect the collectivity of your citizens, Hungarian men and Hungarian women. Contrary to what you're saying, this is not a report which is denouncing anything being done by your country, but rather what is being done by your government. We are not calling into question the honour of Hungary in any way. On the contrary, we seek to defend it, and we seek to protect it from your autocratic tendencies, because you are not defending the freedom of the Hungarians. You are simply seeking to consolidate your personal power. You're not protecting them. You are simply pitting them the one against the other. You are not serving the interests of your country. You are seeking to close it behind the barriers of an authoritarian regime which is worse than the one from which you claimed to save it 30 years ago. This must be brought to a halt. And the vote on the Sargentini report is a first step in the correct direction. Thank you.
Honorable Choprad.
Monsieur Prad.
Madame Sargentini. Mrs. Sargentini, I'm French. I live in Vienna, in Austria, just a stone's throw away from Budapest. and I observe reality in Central Europe. I'm a Western European observer, and strangely enough, we're not seeing the same things. It seems to me that you're actually reading history with ideological specs on, and you're not really looking at reality as it is. The European Union is in the process of destroying its own legitimacy. In other words, this project of unity and getting the people behind that. I think people want a powerful Europe, but they don't want a Europe that welcomes enemies, that allows them to proliferate, and that silences those who speak out against this collective madness. So, a procedure which would be based on erroneous facts. Obviously, it's a political trial that you're talking about here. And of course, this can have consequences in Poland, Austria, the Czech Republic, Hungary, all those who are unwilling to make the same mistakes as the West when it comes to migration. And therefore, those who trigger this procedure will be actually shouldering a great deal of responsibility, because Mr. Orban is right in this battle.
Onorevole Bizzotto.
Ms. Bizzotto.
Benvenuto, Presidente.
Welcome, President Orban. Dear Prime Minister Orban, you are a hero in this Parliament. You're a hero fighting for freedom and sovereignty of your own people against the Soviet Union and the European Union. The Hungarian people is under attack from this Europe, which is simply enslaved by the banks and Soros. This is why Brussels is taking you to task. Tomorrow they'll be attacking us. And Salvini, our leader, who is showing great courage in stopping illegal immigration. President Orban, we have and share the same values, the values of those who seek to defend their identity and popular sovereignty, the honour of those who want to protect their borders from illegal migration. This is a Europe which will be changed by you and by me from root and branch. It will be changed so that we have justice and real democracy for our citizens. So have the courage of your convictions together with me. We stand together, and in the wake of the elections next year, we will construct together a new Europe, a Europe of the peoples, of the homelands and of great freedoms. Thank you.
Onorevole Karas.
Mr. Karas.
Herren Präsidenten, Frau Ratspräsidentin.
Presidents, Madam President in Office, Prime Minister, the EU is a community of values, so there can be no question. The rule of law, the Charter of Fundamental Rights are the basis for any political action. Values and law are not party political. They're not subject to any tactical machinations. Liberal democracy is not coming to an end, as you said. Liberal democracy is fundamentally different from authoritarian democracy. European democracy respects European fundamental values, takes account of the views of others, shows respect to all people, protects minorities, protects independence and freedom. There are very many questions in relation to what's going on in Hungary. These statements against liberal democracy, the stoking of anti-Semitism, action against Mr. Soros is the buzzword. The text of the referendum, the NGO legislation, nepotism, corruption, the threats at the private university, the limitation of the freedom of the press. Mr. Orban, it is in your interest, it is in the interest of everybody, our common interest, for a dialogue, a structured dialogue under Article 7 on the rule of law to be initiated. Ultimately, what's at stake is the credibility of the Union, your credibility too, the credibility of the quality of our coexistence. Populism, nationalism are ideas that exclude the notion of Europe. Thank you.
Mr. Ujeli.
Thank you very much, President. Prime Minister, there's one thing that I think both of us know, namely that you're lying in this community, in our family, before our members of parliament, and you're also lying back home before our society. You're lying to Hungary. In Hungary, you're lying to your fellow citizens. You say that you want to defend Hungary from Brussels. You don't need to defend Hungary from Brussels. This is our family. This is our family. And believe me, you don't need to defend Europe either. defend it against some kind of fear that you've been talking about, only scaremongering. What we're talking about here is a regime that you have built up with the oligarchs. This is why you're pursuing this particular policy tack, because you want to defend your regime from the law and from European rules and from the European community. You have basically taken European resources and used them in order to build your empire at home and control it. So, Prime Minister, most importantly, I think that you have also committed a great crime in dividing us. We don't have faith in one another anymore. And it was Goebbels, I think, in the past who divided, Hungarian people into the good and the bad. And you've basically taken away the tricolour from the Hungarian symbol. This national tricolour, the one I'm holding up before you, Prime Minister, which I would like to take back. I'm clawing it back because the homeland is ours for all of us, and we love our country and we love Europe. You have basically put poison into this common community, and that is a real crime, and we're talking about something that will have ramifications for decades and decades, and it will have an impact on Hungary for so long. That is why the procedure according to Article 7 should be adopted by this House and should be triggered, because I think you need to know that nobody can act like this, not with visa in their own country.
Prime Minister, there are problems in Hungary when it comes to questions like corruption, the situation of national minorities and so on. Many of those problems are inherited from the past and they are in no way unique to Hungary. These shortcomings are not the reason why Hungary has become the prime target of the Commission and this Parliament. The real sin of the Hungarian government is that it wants to protect the country from damaging mass immigration from the third world. The Hungarian government and the majority of the Hungarian voters do not wish to repeat the catastrophic mistakes we have made in Western Europe. I very much sympathise and support that position. Unfortunately, liberal immigration policies and multiculturalism have become the European value in this House. Almost anything else can be forgiven, but not questioning that value. This is why we are having this debate. Thank you.
Monsieur le Président, merci.
Thank you, President. Prime Minister Orban, thank you and well done. Bravo. Thanks very much for giving us hope in resisting European federalism. Thanks for returning to Hungarians their dignity as free citizens. Your courage is admirable in the fight against the Euro-globalist caste of Davos and Brussels, incarnate in Hungary in Mr. Soros. Hungarians are attached to their national identity, and they are grateful to you and have shown it in the ballot box. You protect the Hungarians against the deathly danger of immigration, against the Islamist terrorism and the steamroller of globalism which eliminates cultural difference. Mr. Orban is a patriot, strongly pro. He is developing a credible alternative together with the Italians to the federalists of Merkel, Macron, Juncker. They want to punish and demonise him. In the name of democracy, Mr. Sargentini's reported and Article 7 have to be rejected. They are totalitarian in nature. That's why tomorrow we'll vote against this dreadful report. Mr. Mono, do not change. Long live Hungarian Fidesz.
Honorevole Wilimski.
Mr. Wilimski.
Präsident, meine sehr geehrten Damen und Herren,
Thank you very much, President. I'd like to apologise in advance for the unholy alliance that appears to exist across the Greens, Communists, Socialists and even the EPP. You, Prime Minister, are being portrayed as being in breach of the treaty, some kind of political miscreant or criminal, whereas nothing could be further from the truth, because you are one of the heroes of Europe. You were our hero when the wave of migration broke over the European Union in 2015. You were our hero. Alone, you stood up and defended the European framework, European law. You did this with your personal conviction, and therefore, how dishonest can the other side of the Parliament possibly be? look at the example we've seen also in the case of Romania. Hundreds of thousands of people who have committed corruption, who have protested against the corruption committed by the regime. People who were out demonstrating against corruption were simply beaten by the police. This is what liberal democracy in Europe is delivering. Therefore, where the socialists govern, people are burying their heads in their sand, and this sort of thing which is going on has to be denounced resoundingly. You have friends in Europe, in Italy, in many parts of the European Union, in Austria, in Poland, and in many other countries. You have many friends throughout the European Union. Therefore, continue along your path on your roadmap. You are the beacon of hope for many people. Thank you. The next speaker is Ms. Kinga Gál.
Colleagues, Hungarian citizens, including women, are outraged by the fact that you're seeking to defend them against themselves and against their will, because supposedly they're not really able to express their opinions, to practice their religion, social rights, different rights are restricted. But that's actually not the truth. And that's why there's been an open letter sent by civil society against the report by Mr. Sargentini, and there are so many who dispute the various allegations in this report. Thousands of people, thousands of citizens who are angry because the report is not talking about the many thousands of good and positive civil society activities. You're only really talking about a small number of NGOs and the question of their financing. But of course you need to know that these NGOs that you're talking about here lost their credibility already at the time of the socialist regime, when they were quiet about the measures taken by that regime. So therefore, colleagues, let's remember that there are two targets here. You want to punish Hungary because it had a policy which was consistent and which spoke out against mass immigration. And secondly, I think we're looking towards the next elections and you're trying to divide. We all know that a procedure according to Article 7 and the triggering of that will, of course, have consequences. This is a report that does not really talk about us. It talks about those who are purely basing themselves on ideology in drafting such a report. If you believe in a common Europe, then please vote against this report tomorrow. Thank you.
The next speaker is Ms. Kienge. Thank you very much, President. This resolution is not directed against the Hungarian people. On the contrary, they deserve and will have all our support and friendship. The resolution is, on the contrary, directed against the government of Viktor Orban, which is systematically violating every single fundamental value and rule of the European Union. It is violating the Constitution and the judicial system. It is violating freedom of expression and denying the rights of refugees, migrants and all the minorities in the country of Hungary. There are no halfway houses, no intermediary pieces, no halfway houses. It is absolutely essential that we recognise that what is happening in Hungary today could quite well be replicated elsewhere throughout the European Union, anywhere. And therefore, we need to look at these serious violations perpetrated by the Orban government and see where else they could occur. The Socialist and Democrat government will vote in its entirety in favour of this resolution, because we will not be implicitly or specifically involved in this desecration of freedom which is taking place in Hungary. We want a Europe which is free, which stands up for democracy and gives democracy and freedom of speech to all its citizens. Thank you. Thank you. The next speaker is Ms. McAvey.
Premierul maghiar a încercat în discursul său.
Thank you. The Hungarian Prime Minister has tried to manipulate the Hungarian people in his speech. We're not against the Hungarian nation, Hungarian people. We are, however, opposed to politicians who breach European values, and that holds true for the Prime Minister of Hungary. Now, when I talk about Budapest, I'm actually talking about the power in place, which is copying practices that we already know from Moscow. Prime Minister Orban explicitly supports an illiberal system, a system where the civil society, where academia, the press, diversity, independent judiciary, where none of these have their place anymore. We know that European funds simply disappear. There have been 35 cases that have been investigated by Olaf when it comes to cohesion funds. That has simply disappeared. That money's disappeared. Now, you may ask, where's it gone? We don't know, and a colleague in this debate has already made that point. We're talking about 40,000 euros, and we would want that money to come back from Hungary, come back from the political branch of power of that country. As for the governor, the director of the Central European University, said this publicly. There have always been people who have been happy to hear what Mr. Orban has to say about migration. However, the problem for all of us is to know whether this is about economic freedom, freedom of the press and liberty. Do they like that as well? Everything that Mr. Orban is doing against democracy, against freedom of the press, against economic freedom and against economic values, do they like that as well? That's what we need to vote on.
Prime Minister, we should probably be glad that you found a way, because I hear that you posted a video message on Facebook that you were going to Brussels to protect Hungary. This isn't of course Brussels, right? But since Brussels is all that embodies the nefarious influences upon Hungary for you, I suppose that between here and Brussels there is no difference. Europe has to be Brussels, and Brussels is not good for the country, because it would impose migration, because it would impose certain functioning measures and certain democratic standards, probably because it would also be looking after its money. And honestly, I'm sick and tired. I'm sick and tired of seeing 5 billion euros go every year to essentially make a few people close to you richer every year. And with having for the rest a Hungarian economy which is probably glad that 700,000 people have left it over the last 10 years, because otherwise they would be in the country and unemployed. The only reason why the unemployment is where it is not the prowess of the government, is the fact that people have voted with their feet. Now, otherwise, what happens with the money? Enormous billboard campaigns against Brussels, against the Commission, against the Parliament, against the Commission President.